You're a Muslim woman in 1099 Jerusalem. The city walls have fallen to Crusader armies, and your husband lies dead in the streets below. Now Christian knights are breaking down your door, and what awaits you will make his death seem merciful. For 2 centuries, the Crusades reshaped the medieval world. We remember them for epic battles, legendary knights, and the struggle for the Holy Land. But there's a darker truth buried in the chronicles of these holy wars. A systematic pattern of brutality that historians have largely overlooked, hidden behind the rhetoric of religious conquest and noble purpose. Before we continue, if you find this type of historical analysis compelling, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It genuinely helps us create more content like this. Now, let's examine what really happened when Crusader forces achieved victory over Muslim territories. When Crusader armies conquered a city, the aftermath followed patterns that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with deliberate policy. This wasn't the chaotic violence of medieval warfare. This was systematic exploitation implemented with shocking consistency across dozens of conquered territories throughout the Levant. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 provides our most detailed evidence of Crusader practices. When Godfrey of Bouillon's forces finally breached the city's defences, they initiated what contemporary chronicles describe as a 3-day period of organised brutality. But the Crusader accounts treat these same events as righteous acts of divine justice. The process began immediately after military resistance collapsed. Adult Muslim males were systematically executed not during combat, but in organised groups after surrender. Crusader military orders had established clear protocols for these executions, viewing them as necessary to prevent future rebellions. Boys over the age of 10 were included in these killings if they showed any signs of potential resistance. But death was reserved primarily for males. Muslim women faced something that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe directly, often using euphemisms that barely concealed the horror of what actually occurred. Crusader military law, codified in documents that survive in European archives, established specific procedures for what they termed population management. Women were immediately separated into categories based on age, physical condition, and perceived value. This sorting happened in public spaces, often in front of burning mosques or demolished civic buildings, ensuring maximum psychological impact on both victims and any surviving population. Young women between approximately 15 and 30 comprised the most valuable category. Crusader records from the Jerusalem conquest list over 3,000 women in this group, each assigned to specific knights or military orders, based on their service record and status within the army hierarchy. These weren't abstract statistics. They were human beings distributed like spoils of war in ledgers that treated them as property. The second category included women between 30 and 45, considered suitable for manual labour, but past their prime for other purposes. The third category, women over 45, often faced immediate execution alongside elderly men deemed too old to justify the resources required for their maintenance. Children presented special opportunities for the Crusader states. Boys under 10 were frequently taken for conversion programs, designed to transform them into Christian soldiers loyal to the new regime. Girls under 12 entered what Crusader documents euphemistically called formation houses, institutions designed to prepare them for specific roles within the emerging Frankish society. The psychological warfare embedded in these procedures was as carefully planned as any military campaign. Families were forced to witness the sorting process. Mothers watching daughters assigned to different categories, knowing they would never see them again. The Crusaders understood that this psychological trauma would spread throughout remaining populations, making future resistance far less likely. Contemporary accounts describe how Crusader knights would deliberately separate mothers from infant children, not for practical reasons, but to maximize emotional distress. Crying babies were often killed immediately, not out of cruelty toward the infants, but to demonstrate complete power over their mothers. The message was unmistakable. Resistance meant watching your children die. The scale of what happened in Jerusalem provides a template for understanding Crusader conquest patterns throughout their 2-century presence in the Holy Land. Within 72 hours of the city's fall, approximately 40,000 people had been processed through these categories. 8,000 women and girls were distributed among the conquering army as personal property. Another 6,000 were assigned to various military orders and noble houses throughout the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the systematic nature of Crusader practices becomes truly disturbing when we examine their documentation methods. The Crusader states maintained detailed records because these weren't spontaneous war crimes. They were planned administrative activities that required careful accounting for the efficient management of their new territories. Ships' manifests from the period list human cargo alongside grain, wine, and precious metals. A typical entry might read 20 barrels of wine, 50 sacks of wheat, 12 females aged 18 to 25 years, good condition. The women weren't even granted the dignity of names in these documents, just ages, physical descriptions, and assigned values. The economic infrastructure supporting this system stretched across the entire Crusader presence in the Levant. Specialized markets in major cities like Antioch and Tripoli had dedicated sections for human trafficking, with established pricing structures that fluctuated based on supply and demand. A young Arab or Turkish woman might command 15 to 20 silver pieces in acres markets, while Nubian or Ethiopian women brought different prices depending on their origins and physical characteristics. The Crusaders didn't invent slavery, but they systematized it in ways that previous medieval armies had rarely achieved. They created standardized procedures for capture, transport, and distribution that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Bills of sale, transport receipts, and household inventories survive in Crusader archives, documenting human misery with the same attention to detail applied to any other administrative function. Perhaps most disturbing was how this system created its own momentum. Success in Crusader military campaigns was measured not just in territory conquered, but in people captured. Knights received land grants and monetary rewards based partly on the number and quality of prisoners taken. This created incentives for targeting civilian populations rather than focusing solely on military objectives. The psychological impact on surviving populations was precisely what Crusader strategists intended. Villages and towns that witnessed these processing procedures often surrendered without resistance when Crusader armies appeared on the horizon. The Crusader reputation for systematic brutality became a weapon more effective than siege engines or cavalry charges. Women who survived the initial sorting faced journeys to various destinations throughout the Crusader states, each carrying its own specific horrors. Those destined for noble households traveled in specially constructed wagons with enclosed compartments designed for human transport. Archaeological evidence from Crusader sites reveals restraint mechanisms, ventilation systems, and waste management designed to keep human cargo alive during weeks-long journeys across hostile territory. The wagons were mobile prisons, but they were also laboratories for systematic dehumanization. Women were stripped of clothing, names, and any personal possessions that might remind them of their previous lives. They were given simple garments that marked their status as property and assigned numbers that would replace their birth names. The process was designed to break psychological resistance before they reached their final destinations. Crusader records indicate mortality rates during transport averaged around 12%, considered acceptable losses by administrators who viewed human cargo through purely economic calculations. Women who died during transport were simply buried in unmarked graves along established routes. Their deaths recorded in ledgers alongside spoiled grain or damaged equipment. The Crusader approach to conquered women reveals a level of systematic planning that challenges traditional narratives about medieval warfare. This wasn't religious fervor or cultural misunderstanding. This was deliberate policy implemented across 2 centuries and multiple kingdoms, designed to transform human beings into commodities while simultaneously terrorizing entire populations into submission. But the true horror wasn't just in what happened during conquest. It was in what came afterward, when the systematic exploitation of women became the foundation of Crusader state administration. The legal framework of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader territories transformed rape into marriage, murder into justice, and slavery into divine mandate. Crusader legal codes preserved in archives across Europe spell out procedures that legalized every form of sexual violence imaginable. These weren't aberrations or violations of law. They were the law. The concept of war brides became central to Crusader expansion and settlement strategy. When a Muslim warrior died in battle against Crusader forces, his widow automatically became property of whoever claimed her, provided the claim followed established legal procedures. The claiming process required 2 Christian witnesses and had to occur within 48 hours of the husband's death. After that window, other knights could challenge ownership, leading to disputes over women that Crusader courts treated as standard property disagreements. Legal documents from the period show detailed proceedings where knights argued over human beings like merchants disputing ownership of livestock. But legal ownership was just the beginning. The transformation of conquered women into war brides required systematic destruction of their previous identities. Names were changed immediately, often to European versions that bore no resemblance to their birth names. Religious conversion was mandatory, enforced through procedures that combined psychological torture with religious instruction. The conversion process involved public ceremonies where women were forced to renounce their previous faith, often required to desecrate Islamic texts or religious symbols from their former lives. Those who refused faced escalating punishments designed to break resistance without reducing their economic value. The Crusader states maintained conversion centers in major cities, facilities designed specifically for processing conquered women. Archaeological excavations at sites in Acre and Antioch have revealed building foundations with specialized chambers, drainage systems, and restraint mechanisms that paint a picture of industrial-scale psychological warfare. These centers operated for decades, processing thousands of women through standardized programs designed to erase cultural memory and replace it with complete subservience. The programs typically lasted 4 months, long enough to ensure pregnancy from systematic rape, creating biological bonds that made escape psychologically impossible. Children born from these forced unions faced their own systematic exploitation. Mixed-blood offspring were often killed immediately if they showed signs of resembling their mothers too closely, seen as inconvenient evidence of the violence that created them. Survivors were raised to serve the Crusader states, never knowing their mothers' real names or original cultures. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual victims to entire populations. The Crusaders deliberately publicized their treatment of conquered women, spreading detailed accounts through territories they planned to invade. The reputation for systematic sexual violence became a weapon of conquest more effective than any military technology. Villages would surrender without fighting rather than subject their women to documented Crusader procedures. The Crusader state's own chroniclers wrote proudly of cities that capitulated immediately upon hearing what had happened to women in previously conquered territories. Fear became their most effective military asset, but surrender offered no protection. The Crusaders had learned that terrorized populations were easier to control than grateful ones. Even cities that submitted voluntarily often found their women subjected to the same systematic exploitation, justified as necessary for maintaining Christian dominance in Muslim lands. The tribute system formalized this exploitation on a massive scale. Beyond the famous taxes imposed on Muslim populations, the Crusader states maintained systematic collection of women from subject territories. Young women were taken from Muslim families under legal frameworks that treated them as property taxes owed to Christian overlords. These levies operated with bureaucratic precision, targeting specific age groups and physical characteristics deemed most valuable. Crusader administrators calculated optimal collection rates, balancing economic benefit against the risk of provoking rebellions. The calculations appear in administrative documents that treat human suffering as mathematical problems requiring technical solutions. The Crusader state's systematic exploitation of conquered women wasn't an aberration of medieval warfare. It was deliberate policy that operated for 2 centuries, documented in their own records with bureaucratic precision. These practices shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands, created cultural trauma that persisted for generations, and remind us how quickly civilized societies can normalize the unthinkable when religious fervor combines with unchecked power. The archives are there, preserved in European monasteries and libraries, waiting for historians willing to confront this uncomfortable truth about the so-called holy wars. Behind the romanticized tales of noble knights and religious crusades lies a systematic machinery of human exploitation that treated women as commodities and terror as policy. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the complexity of the medieval world, but it forces us to see past the mythology and confront the reality of what conquest actually meant for ordinary people caught in the path of armies carrying crosses. The women of Jerusalem, Antioch, and countless other cities deserved better than to be erased from history. They deserved to have their suffering remembered, not hidden behind chronicles of glory and divine mandate. Their stories matter because they reveal how power operates when it believes itself sanctified by higher purpose. The Crusaders genuinely believed they were doing God's work, which made their systematic brutality even more chilling.